When I was 4 years old, that was 1969 for anyone who wants the math, my grandparents took me to see my first Broadway show. It was Fiddler on the Roof with Zero Mostel. Yes, amazing. We had front row seats, and as legend would have it, I didn't get out of my seat for the entire show. I was mesmerized. For years later, I did a great Fruma Sarah imitation, but that's for another time. On the way home, we got to take the subway back to their Bronx apartment. My grandparents lived literally behind Yankee Stadium. And we lost my grandmother on the subway. I mean, not really losing, like she rode the subway all the time, but I was 4. And so this expression was, we losted grandma. And that became a piece of family lore. We losted grandma. We did find her later on at their apartment. But my grandmother lived to be 94, my grandfather to be nearly 103, and that story continued for years. As I continue to tell it, I think my kids have heard it a few dozen times, it reminds me of many things. First, my grandfather's work in the theater. My grandfather was an entertainment lawyer. Second, how much my grandparents loved the arts. My grandfather used to say that when he was involved with, his clients were involved in the theater, that's when previews were really previews. You didn't pay to go see a preview, and he was often involved in filling the house for his clients. The story reminds me of my grandfather's pride in his education. He was born in Romania, grew up on the Lower East Side, and was the first kid on his block to go to college. It speaks, too, to the relationship I cherished with my grandparents well into my 30s. And while it seems like a light story, and it is, right? We lost grandma, we laughed about it, it was theater. It speaks to me these years later. My grandparents have been deceased 20 and 30 years. It speaks to me to their legacy, family loyalty, integrity, hard work, and of course, humor. In the musical Hamilton, you may recall there's a song, I believe sung by Eliza. When you're gone, who remembers your name? Who keeps your flame? Who tells your story? Thoughtful and profound questions, aren't they? Who does tell our story? Who remembers what we did, what we do in the world? Torah doesn't leave this to chance. The entire book of Deuteronomy is about telling our story, a recap of our ancestors' journeys to the Promised Land. We have a key piece of that in this week's Torah portion, Ki Tavo. Our ancestors enter the land. They're told when they enter the land to bring their first fruits, that's the best of their harvest, to a sacred place, acknowledge that God helped them get there and get the harvest of food, and then they are to tell their story. Familiar passage, I suspect, to many. That story goes as follows. My father was a fugitive, or sometimes a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but became a great and populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to Adonai, the God of our ancestors, who heard our plea, saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. Adonai freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, and awesome power, and by signs and portents, bringing us to this place and giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Why, I now bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, Adonai, have given me. It's a short-form Jewish history, really, the biblical history in one paragraph. It's probably better known to many of you from the Haggadah. Oh yeah, it's been included in the Haggadah for generations upon generations. And it's a powerful example of narrative, here scripted, that gives the subsequent generations their identity. Narrative. Narrative is vital to Judaism and to each of us. Judaism in its story gives us meaning, identity, and survival. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has written, it gives us answers to the key questions of our existence. Who am I? Why am I here? How then shall I live? First, who am I? This short history of the Jewish people I just read tells us where we came from and who we're connected to. Not literally every generation, but it starts with our biblical forebears. As Sachs writes, it is through narratives that we learn who we are and how we are called on to behave. It is to understand the stories of which we're a part. Second, why are we here and what do we need to do in the world? Or what is our task? Torah, Sachs says, is not a theological treatise, but a series of interlinked stories, going from Abraham and Sarah's journey from Mesopotamia to Moses and the Israelites' wanderings in the desert. Because Judaism is what? About story. And we're part of that story. And inherent in that story is remembering. And what do we Jews do? I wouldn't say best, but probably best. We remember. As Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi explains, only in Israel and nowhere else is the injunction to remember felt as a religious imperative to an entire people. Think about how many times you've heard in Torah, in our prayer, remember. Like, remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Remember what Amalek did to you. Remember what God did to Miriam. Remember the days of old. Consider the generations long past. Ask your father, and he will tell you, your elders, and they will explain to you. So here in Ki Tavo, Moses, the storyteller, gives the people their story. Now remember, these are not the people who got out of Egypt. These are their descendants. So they really need the story. They didn't live the Exodus. These people, more than their parents and grandparents, need to know where they came from. Hearing the story gave our biblical ancestors a bigger picture, and it gives us something too. Reporter and author Bruce Feiler writes, "The single most important thing you can do for your family may be the simplest of all. Develop a strong family narrative." Feiler cites research that shows clearly that children who know more about their families proved more resilient, meaning they could moderate the effects of stress. Why? Because they had a sense of being part of something larger. And whether that narrative that they're part of is something ascending, like it's all successful and goes up, or descending, life went down, or most often oscillating, right? Going up and down. We all have our ups and downs. It's important, he writes, for unifying and giving the children a sense of their own experiences in perspective. So that's for one individual family's narrative. But this story that we recap in short form tonight is our collective family narrative. It's the narrative of an entire people giving us connection to something larger than ourselves. Also good for perspective and resilience. In this instance, in Ki Tavo, Rabbi Sachs teaches that for the first time, the retelling of a nation's history becomes an obligation. Everyone must do it. They're told to do it. Our ancestors were told to become a people of storytellers. But telling the story is only part of it. So you may recall what I read. Our ancestors are told to tell the story, and then a little bit later, it's also told to share their offerings that they bring. They're supposed to bring their first fruits, share it with the Levites and the strangers, and even later give a tenth of their harvest to the Levites, the strangers, the fatherless, and the widow. That is, give food to those people who don't have the means for sustenance, who are not landowners. And then they're supposed to say out loud that they're doing. That passage that I read this is the history, and God, thank you for getting me here. I'm here to tell you my story. That's my story. So in other words, we're supposed to tell the story, give to others, and teach what we're doing and why. Rabbi Claudia Kryman explains that the order here is key. It's important. Experience gratitude, recognize God's blessing, retell the story, and then act on the connection that that story gives us. Giving to others, sharing the blessing of abundance. Good mission. Experience gratitude, recognize God's blessing, connect to our greater story, and act with kindness toward others. It's a good mission for today. It's a good mission for every day, and certainly a mission in these days leading up to Rosh Hashanah. We have 2 weeks left of Elul leading up to Rosh Hashanah. Not what any rabbi really wants to think about, but anyway. We have time to reflect. I invite you to take time and reflect on the gratitude and blessing in your lives. Let us realize or emphasize that we're part of something bigger. And let us act on our connection to others and share our abundance. Going back to those words from Hamilton, who keeps our flame? Who tells our story? Let's start close to home. Each of us, all of us. Shabbat Shalom.